Marcus Wellington, billionaire CEO of Wellington Industries, stood abruptly from the corner table at the Sterling Room, his jaw tight with disgust as he dismissed the woman across from him as just another gold digger chasing his fortune. His 7-year-old daughter, Emma, brought along as his convenient excuse to leave early. Called after him with a trembling voice he was too angry to hear. But what Marcus didn't know, what his grief-hardened heart couldn't see, was that the woman sitting alone at that table with tears pooling in her eyes was Sarah Mitchell, the elementary school teacher who had been staying late every single day for the past 3 months to tutor Emma for free, patiently teaching his struggling daughter to read after her mother's death. The same teacher who had spent her own meager salary to buy Emma new books when she noticed the girl had none. The same woman who had been quietly, selflessly changing his daughter's life while he was too consumed by grief and boardroom battles to notice, too blinded by loss to see the angel who had been saving his little girl all along. Marcus Wellington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 57th floor. Manhattan spread beneath him like a kingdom he had conquered but could no longer feel. At 42 years old, he was worth $3.7 billion. Give or take a few million depending on the market's mood, a self-made titan who had built Wellington Industries from a single patent and a dream into an empire that employed 12,000 people across 4 continents. The office around him spoke of power in hushed, expensive tones. Italian marble floors, a desk carved from a single piece of Brazilian walnut, original abstract art that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But if anyone had looked closely, really looked, they would have seen the truth hiding in plain sight. In the bottom drawer of that magnificent desk, face down and covered by forgotten files, lay a framed photograph of Rebecca, his late wife, her smile too painful to witness in the fluorescent light of ambition. Emma's crayon drawings, sent up by his assistant each week, sat in an unopened manila folder on the credenza, colorful attempts at love that he hadn't found time to examine. His penthouse apartment 20 blocks away was even worse. A monument to wealth and emptiness where rooms echoed and designer furniture remained pristine because no one actually lived there. Not really, not in any way that mattered. 3 years had passed since Rebecca's death. 3 years since cancer had stolen her away and left him hollow, and in that time Marcus had done what he knew how to do. He had worked, he had closed deals and expanded markets and increased shareholder value by 43%, and he had slowly, methodically, stopped being a father, stopped being a man, stopped being anything except a signature on contracts and a voice on conference calls. His sister Jennifer had been calling every week for the past 6 months, her persistence both annoying and oddly touching, insisting that Emma needed a mother figure, that he needed to move on, that life was passing them both by while he hid behind spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Marcus had resisted, argued, flat-out refused, because the thought of replacing Rebecca, of letting someone new into the space she had occupied, felt like betrayal wrapped in practicality. But Jennifer wore him down the way water wears down stone, patient and relentless, until finally, exhausted and desperate for peace, he agreed to one blind date. Just one, just to prove to her that it wouldn't work, that he wasn't ready, that some wounds didn't heal just because the calendar said they should. He would go, he would be polite, he would leave early using Emma as his excuse. And then Jennifer would finally, mercifully, leave him alone. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Sarah Mitchell woke at 5:30 in the morning when her alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness of her studio apartment in Queens. The sound jarring but familiar, the beginning of another day in a life built on purpose rather than comfort. At 29 years old, she lived in 250 square feet of space that cost her $1,800 a month, nearly half her teacher's salary, in a building where the radiator clanked like a ghost and the neighbor upstairs practiced violin at odd hours. The furniture around her told the story of a life assembled from thrift stores and sidewalk findings. A couch with a torn armrest covered by a throw blanket, a kitchen table that wobbled unless you remembered which leg to avoid, The bookshelves made from cinder blocks and wooden planks that sagged under the weight of children's literature she had purchased with her own money because her classroom budget ran out in September. The stack of bills on her kitchen counter waited with patient menace, electricity and student loans, and the credit card she had used last month to buy winter coats for 2 of her students whose parents couldn't afford them. She made herself coffee in a chipped mug, showered in a bathroom where the tiles were cracked but clean, dressed in one of her 5 work outfits that she rotated carefully to make it seem like she had more. The subway ride to Riverside Elementary took 45 minutes, packed between strangers, her bag heavy with books and supplies, her mind already running through the day's lesson plans and the particular challenge of Emma Wellington, the quiet 7-year-old girl who sat in the back of her classroom and struggled with reading in a way that broke Sarah's heart. Emma was bright. Sarah knew that, could see the intelligence in those sad gray eyes. But the girl was lost somewhere in grief and neglect, drowning in a sea of words she couldn't decode, while her billionaire father signed checks for the school's new gymnasium but never showed up for parent-teacher conferences. Sarah had been staying late with Emma every day for 3 months now, completely free of charge, working on phonics and sight words and confidence. Because that's what teachers do, that's why she had become a teacher in the first place. To be for other children what no one had been for her when she was small and alone in the foster system. She arrived at school by 6:45, unlocked her classroom, arranged desks and prepared materials, greeted her students with genuine smiles when they arrived, because every child deserved to feel seen. Her phone buzzed during lunch. A text from her friend Katie about the blind date set up for tonight, some successful businessman who was apparently nice, and Sarah almost canceled right then, exhausted and feeling inadequate, and not in the mood to pretend she belonged in whatever fancy world this man inhabited. But Katie had been so excited, so hopeful, that Sarah found herself typing yes, okay, see you at 8, even as her heart whispered that this was a mistake. Marcus pulled up to Riverside Elementary at 3:15 in his black Mercedes, rare for him to do the pickup himself, but his afternoon meeting had been canceled, and Mrs. Chen had the day off, so here he was, phone pressed to his ear as his attorney walked him through the final details of the Singapore merger that would add another $200 million to the company's bottom line. He barely glanced up as Emma emerged from the building's double doors, her small figure weighed down by a backpack that seemed too large for her frame, and he completely failed to notice the woman standing in the doorway behind his daughter. The young teacher with kind eyes who was waving goodbye, her hand lingering in the air as if hoping he might look up, might see her, might acknowledge the months of work she had poured into his child. Emma climbed into the back seat, clutching a stack of books wrapped in brown paper, and Marcus nodded at her in the rearview mirror, while continuing his conversation about contract clauses and international tax implications. In the car, Emma tried 3 times to tell him about her reading progress, about how she had finished a whole chapter book by herself, about how Miss Mitchell said she was doing so well, but each time her small voice was swallowed by her father's business jargon and distracted. That meant he wasn't really listening, wasn't really there even though he sat just 2 feet away. When they arrived home, Mrs. Chen was already preparing dinner, having returned early from her errands, and she smiled at Emma, asked about school, then mentioned to Marcus that Miss Mitchell had been absolutely wonderful, staying late every single day to help Emma with her reading, such a dedicated teacher, so rare to find someone who truly cared. Marcus nodded absently, filing the name Miss Mitchell somewhere in the back of his mind, where it joined 1,000 other details he didn't have time to examine. Just another teacher doing her job, nothing requiring his attention or gratitude. That evening, after Emma was in bed, or supposedly in bed, Jennifer called to confirm the blind date, her voice bright with hope that made Marcus tired. He agreed. Yes. Tomorrow night, the Sterling room at 8. But even as he confirmed the details, he was already planning his escape, his exit strategy, and his way to make this evening as short and painless as possible. He would bring Emma, he decided, tell the woman it was a family emergency or that his sitter had canceled, bring his daughter along as a buffer and an excuse, because what woman would want to sit through a first date with a 7-year-old at the table? If things were going badly, which he fully expected they would, He could claim Emma was tired or uncomfortable and leave after 20 minutes with a clear conscience. When he told Emma the next morning that she would be joining him for dinner at a fancy restaurant, the girl's face lit up with such pure, surprised joy that something twisted painfully in his chest, the realization that his daughter was excited simply to spend time with him, that this had become so rare that she treated it like a gift. But Marcus pushed the feeling away, convinced himself he was doing his best, that providing for her financially was what mattered, that everything else would sort itself out eventually. Sarah stood in front of the full-length mirror that leaned against her studio apartment wall, the one she had found on the curb 3 years ago, and tried to convince herself she looked acceptable in her nicest dress, a simple navy blue sheath she had bought on sale 4 years ago for her college roommate's wedding. The fabric was good quality, but the style was dated. The hem slightly frayed at the back, where she had caught it on a subway turnstile, and as she turned slowly in the dim light of her apartment, she felt the familiar weight of not belonging settling onto her shoulders like an old coat. Katie had set this up, her well-meaning friend from teacher training who had married into money and now lived in Westchester, insisting that this man was successful but nice, genuinely nice, someone Sarah should meet. But standing here now, Sarah felt like a child playing dress-up in a world that would see through her immediately. She almost canceled at 6:30, her finger hovering over Katie's number, almost canceled again at 7 when she couldn't get her hair to behave, almost canceled a third time at 7:30 when she looked at her bank account and realized she couldn't actually afford a taxi if the subway made her late. She had never fit into the world of wealthy Manhattan men, had gone on exactly 2 dates with men from that sphere, and both times had felt like an anthropologist studying an alien species, their casual mentions of summer homes and ski trips and private schools landing like foreign languages she had never learned to speak. The subway ride into Manhattan took 50 minutes, and she emerged at 59th Street feeling rumpled and anxious, walking the 4 blocks to the Sterling Room in shoes that pinched because they were the only dressy pair she owned. The restaurant rose before her like a temple to wealth, all gleaming glass and soft golden light spilling onto the sidewalk. A doorman in a uniform that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and Sarah almost turned around right there but forced herself forward because she had promised Katie, because backing out now would be rude, because maybe, just maybe, this could be different. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Wellington sat in the back of his private car, Emma beside him in a pale pink designer dress that his personal shopper had selected, and checked his Rolex for the 3rd time, confirming that he had planned this perfectly to stay exactly 20 minutes before manufacturing an excuse to leave. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, his tie Italian silk, his cufflinks platinum, armor against the world disguised as fashion. And he had already decided this wouldn't work, couldn't work, because he wasn't ready and probably never would be, and bringing Emma was insurance against having to try. His driver pulled up to the Sterling Room at 7:58, 2 minutes early, exactly as Marcus preferred, and he helped Emma out of the car with the distant politeness of a man going through motions, a father performing fatherhood rather than feeling it, already calculating how quickly he could extract them both from this doomed evening and return to the safe, cold comfort of his empty penthouse. Marcus and Emma entered the Sterling Room through heavy brass doors that whispered open with the kind of smoothness that only extreme expense could buy. And the maitre d', a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and a French accent, greeted Marcus by name because men like Marcus Wellington were always known in places like this, always recognized, always given the best table with the best view and the most discreet service. He led them through the dining room where crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths and the quiet murmur of wealth, past couples leaning close over wine glasses and businessmen celebrating deals, to a corner table where a woman sat alone, nervous energy radiating from her like heat, clutching a modest black purse in her lap as if it were a life preserver. Marcus saw her and in less than 3 seconds had performed the calculus he always performed with strangers. The instant assessment of value and threat and intention that came from building an empire in a world full of sharks. He saw her simple dress, clearly off the rack and a few years old. saw the way she sat too straight in her chair like someone trying to look comfortable in a place she didn't belong. They saw the nervous way her fingers worried at the clasp of her purse, and immediately categorized her as trying too hard, impressed by money, probably calculating his net worth before hello even left her lips. Sarah saw them approaching, and her heart lurched because she saw Emma first. Sweet Emma Wellington, with her sad eyes and quiet voice, her student, her girl, the child she stayed late for every single day, and Sarah's face lit up with genuine surprise and joy before she could stop herself, before her mind caught up and whispered that this was wrong. This was Marcus Wellington, Emma's father. This was the blind date. Oh God. She quickly schooled her expression, tried to make her face neutral, professional. Didn't want to make this more awkward than it was about to become. But Marcus didn't recognize her at all, had never bothered to learn what his daughter's teacher looked like, had never attended a single school event or parent conference, had never once looked up from his phone during pickup to see the woman who was saving his child. The maitre d' made introductions with practiced elegance, and Sarah stood on shaking legs, opened her mouth to explain, to say something, anything. But Marcus cut her off with a cold handshake, his grip firm and brief and utterly without warmth, his greeting perfunctory and dismissive, already mentally checking out before they had even sat down. But then Emma, beautiful, oblivious Emma, looked past her father and saw Miss Mitchell standing there, and the girl's face transformed with pure delight, a joy so complete and unguarded that it stopped everyone in their tracks. "Miss Mitchell!" she cried out, her small voice ringing with happiness, and she rushed forward past her father's restraining hand to throw her arms around Sarah's waist, hugging her teacher with the fierce love of a child who had found safety in a frightening world. Marcus stood frozen, confused, his carefully constructed exit strategy crumbling as he watched his daughter embrace this stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger at all, his mind racing to understand how Emma knew this woman, why she was hugging her, what connection he had somehow missed. Emma pulled back from the hug, her small hands still clutching Sarah's, and looked up at her father with shining eyes, explaining with the breathless excitement of a child sharing wonderful news. "Daddy, this is Miss Mitchell, my teacher, the one who stays late with me every day, the one who helped me read that whole book about the rabbit. Remember, I told you." Sarah's face showed a kaleidoscope of emotions passing too quickly to hide, surprise and concern and discomfort all warring for dominance. And she released Emma's hands gently, took a small step back, opened her mouth to say something, but the words tangled in her throat, because how could she possibly explain this without making it worse? Marcus stood very still, his mind recalibrating, processing, and then suspicion flooded in cold and certain as winter rain. Because what were the odds, what possible coincidence could explain his daughter's teacher showing up on a blind date with him? And suddenly, it all made sense in the worst possible way. A scheme, an angle, a play for his money, dressed up as romance. His walls, those carefully constructed barriers that had kept the world at bay for 3 years, slammed up instantly, his expression hardening into the face he wore in hostile boardrooms, ice and steel and absolute conviction. Sarah saw the change, saw his eyes go from confused to cold in the space of a heartbeat, and she rushed to explain, her words tumbling over themselves in desperate honesty. "I had no idea, Mr. Wellington. I swear, my friend Katie set this up. She didn't tell me who. I would never. I didn't know it was you." But Marcus didn't believe her. Couldn't believe her. Because people lied to him every day, wanted things from him every hour, and this was just another version of the same tired game. His tone when he spoke was cold enough to frost the wine glasses. Accusatory and cutting. Quite a coincidence. Miss Mitchell, quite a remarkable coincidence indeed, and each word landed like a slap. Sarah's face flushed deep red, embarrassment and hurt flooding her features, and her eyes, those kind eyes that Emma loved, filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. She insisted, her voice shaking but firm. "I would never have agreed if I had known. This is as uncomfortable for me as it is for you. I don't want anything from you. I didn't even know. But Marcus was already moving past listening. Already convinced of her guilt. Already writing her off as just another person trying to use his daughter to get close to his wallet, and his body language screamed rejection and disgust in a way that made other diners begin to notice. Heads turning at nearby tables, whispers starting, the kind of attention that made Sarah want to disappear into the floor. Emma, caught between them, looked from her father's angry face to her teacher's hurt one, confusion clouding her features. Because why was Daddy being mean to Miss Mitchell? Why did he sound like that? Why was everything suddenly wrong when just a moment ago she had been so happy to see them together? And the girl's small voice broke through the tension asking, "Daddy, what's wrong? Why are you mad at Miss Mitchell? She's nice. She's the nicest." Marcus made his decision in the span of a single breath, standing abruptly with enough force that his chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound sharp and final in the hushed elegance of the Sterling room. "This was clearly a misunderstanding," he said, his voice tight and controlled, but loud enough that the couple at the next table stopped mid-conversation, or perhaps a setup, and either way he didn't appreciate whatever game was being played here. Didn't have time for schemes or manipulations dressed up as chance encounters. Sarah's face went pale, all the blood draining away until she looked almost translucent in the candlelight, and she was humiliated and hurt, and beneath those feelings a rising tide of anger because how dare this man who didn't even know his daughter was struggling, who had never once attended a parent conference or volunteered in the classroom, accuse her of schemes when she had poured her heart into his child for months without asking for anything in return. She stood too, her legs shaking but her spine straight, and insisted quietly but firmly that she wasn't playing any game, that she was just as uncomfortable as he was, and that if he would just listen for one moment she could explain. But Marcus wasn't listening. Had already stopped listening the moment suspicion took root in his mind. He reached down and took Emma's hand, his grip firm and unyielding, and told her in a voice that left no room for argument that they were leaving. Right now, this was a mistake, and they were going home. Sarah sank back into her chair as they turned away, trying desperately not to cry as other diners stared openly now, no longer pretending discretion, their faces showing pity and curiosity and judgment, and she felt smaller than she had ever felt, more exposed, more foolish for ever thinking she could exist in this world of crystal and wealth, and people who looked at her and saw nothing worth knowing. Marcus strode toward the exit with Emma stumbling to keep up, his long legs eating the distance between the table and the brass doors, and he was furious. Absolutely furious at Jennifer for setting this trap, at Sarah Mitchell for whatever con she was running, at himself most of all for being stupid enough to agree to this date, for letting his guard down even for a moment, for almost believing that maybe, just maybe, something good could still happen in his life. The rage burned through him clean and hot, familiar and almost comforting in its certainty, better than the alternative which was hope, which was vulnerability, which was the terrifying possibility of caring about someone again and losing them the way he had lost Rebecca. They reached the restaurant doors, the doorman already moving to open them. Marcus already planning the calls he would make, the conversations he would have, the walls he would rebuild even higher than before. But as they reached the threshold between the warm interior and the cold night air beyond, Emma stopped walking, simply stopped, planted her small feet on the marble floor with a determination that surprised them both. She pulled her hand from his grasp, her fingers slipping free, and looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks, her small voice cutting through his anger like a blade through silk when she said, "Daddy, wait. Just wait, please." Emma looked up at her father with tears streaming down her face, her small features twisted with confusion and hurt, and said in a voice that trembled like a leaf in wind, "But Daddy, she's nice. She's really, really nice. Why are you being mean to her?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten, felt the familiar urge to shut down emotion and move forward. And he told her they needed to go, that it was complicated, that she was too young to understand these things, that grown-ups had problems that children couldn't possibly comprehend. But Emma didn't move, didn't follow, didn't give him the obedience he expected and frankly took for granted, and instead she stood there in her beautiful pink dress in the middle of the Sterling room's elegant foyer, and spoke in a quiet, heartbreaking voice that carried the weight of months of loneliness. "Miss Mitchell stays late with me every day," she said, her words precise and devastating. "When you're at work, she helps me read. She bought me books with her own money because you never have time to go to the bookstore." Each word was a knife sliding between Marcus's ribs, sharp and true and impossible to deflect, and he felt something crack inside his chest. Some wall he hadn't even known he was maintaining. Emma continued, the tears falling faster now, her small body shaking with the effort of saying what needed to be said. "She doesn't make me feel stupid like the other kids do. She sits with me when I can't sound out the words. She tells me I'm smart even when I mess up. She brings me snacks because she knows Mrs. Chen packs lunches I don't like. She asks me about Mommy and doesn't change the subject when I start to cry." Marcus stood frozen, truly hearing his daughter for the first time in months, maybe years, hearing the loneliness and need and quiet desperation that he had been too busy, too grief-stricken, too wrapped up in his own pain to notice. Emma's voice dropped to barely a whisper, but in the quiet restaurant it carried like a shout. "She's the only one who doesn't make me feel stupid, Daddy. She's the only one who sees me." The words hung in the air between them. Accusation and plea and simple truth all tangled together, and Marcus felt his knees go weak because his 7-year-old daughter had just told him in the gentlest possible way that he had failed her, that he had been so absent that a stranger had become more of a parent than he had. He turned slowly back toward the restaurant, looked through the glass doors to where Sarah sat alone at the corner table, and he saw her wiping her eyes with a white napkin, her shoulders shaking slightly, gathering her modest purse to leave, preparing to walk out of this humiliation with whatever dignity she could salvage. The maître d' approached her with sympathy written across his distinguished features, probably offering to call her a car, probably apologizing for the scene. And something broke in Marcus's chest, truly broke, shattered like glass under pressure, because he suddenly saw what he had done. Who he had accused, who he had dismissed without even listening, the woman who had been loving his daughter when he had forgotten how. Marcus crouched down slowly, his expensive suit bending awkwardly as he lowered himself to Emma's level, and really looked at his daughter for what felt like the first time in forever, truly saw her instead of just glancing in her direction between emails and conference calls. When had she gotten so sad? He wondered, with a lurch of his heart. When had those gray eyes that reminded him so much of Rebecca's become so haunted? When had her small shoulders begun to carry weight that no 7-year-old should have to bear? And when, God, when, had he stopped seeing her, stopped being present, stopped being the father she deserved? His voice came out rough and uncertain when he asked her, "Do you want to stay? Do you want to have dinner with Miss Mitchell?" And Emma nodded immediately, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, hope blooming across her tear-stained face like flowers after rain. Marcus took a shaky breath, straightened his tie with trembling fingers, and walked back into the Sterling room with Emma's small hand clasped tightly in his, each step feeling like walking against a current, but also somehow like walking toward something he hadn't known he needed. Sarah was standing at the table, her purse clutched to her chest, clearly about to leave, to escape this nightmare of an evening and probably never think kindly of him again, and when she saw them returning, her expression became guarded, hurt, walls up in self-protection that Marcus recognized because they mirrored his own. He stopped at the table, and for the first time since entering this restaurant, since meeting this woman, since probably the last 3 years of his life, he truly looked at another human being, not assessing her value or judging her motivations or calculating what she wanted from him, but simply seeing her, seeing Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had been quietly saving his daughter while he had been too blind to notice. His voice came out rough with emotion, scraped raw by the realization of his own failures, when he said simply, "I was wrong." The words cost him something to say. This man who had built an empire on being right, on trusting his instincts, on never second-guessing his decisions. "Would you please stay?" he asked, not demanded, asked. "Let me start over." Sarah hesitated, her dark eyes moving from Marcus's face to Emma's hopeful, pleading expression. And Marcus could see her weighing it, deciding whether he deserved a second chance or whether this was just another trap waiting to snap shut. Slowly, with visible reluctance, she sat back down, placing her purse carefully on the chair beside her. Marcus sat too, his movements careful and deliberate, and without being asked, Emma climbed into the chair between them, reaching for both their hands with the innocent determination of a child who believed love could fix anything. Her small fingers wrapping around her father's hand and her teacher's hand, bridging the gap between two wounded adults who had forgotten how to trust. They ordered dinner with the help of a patient waiter who pretended not to notice the tension still hanging over the table like morning fog. And Emma, sweet, anxious Emma, filled the silence with nervous chatter, talking about everything and nothing, asking Sarah about the class hamster and telling her father about art class, and recounting a story about recess that involved a swing and a boy named Tyler and a lost shoe, her small voice working overtime to make both adults smile. To smooth over whatever had broken between them, Sarah slowly relaxed as Emma talked, her shoulders coming down from their defensive hunch, her hands unclenching from their white-knuckled grip on her napkin, and she began to talk to Marcus not like a blind date or a woman who had been accused and humiliated, but like a parent talking to another parent, like a teacher conferencing with a father who actually cared. She told him about Emma's progress with reading, how his daughter had gone from barely recognizing sight words to reading full chapter books in just 3 months. How hard Emma had been working, staying focused even when the words swam on the page, practicing every single day with a determination that was remarkable in someone so young. "She should make you so proud," Sarah said softly, looking at Emma with obvious affection. "She's worked harder than any student I've ever taught." Marcus felt something twist in his gut, because he was learning for the first time that Emma had been struggling, that she had been falling behind her classmates, that she had needed help that he hadn't provided, hadn't even noticed she needed. And Sarah Mitchell, this woman he had dismissed as a gold digger, had stepped in to fill the gap his neglect had created. The shame was hot and sharp, but beneath it was gratitude, profound and overwhelming, and he found himself asking in a voice rough with emotion why she had stayed late, why she had spent her own money on books, why she had given so much to a child who wasn't even hers. Sarah looked at Emma for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was simple and honest and devastating in its sincerity. Because she deserved someone to believe in her. The words cut deep, slicing through all of Marcus's defenses and justifications and carefully constructed walls, because they were an indictment and a gift all at once, a reminder of what he should have been doing, and evidence of what this stranger had done instead. Marcus realized in that moment, sitting in the Sterling room with cooling soup and his daughter between them, that Sarah Mitchell had been the mother figure Emma needed, had been filling a role that should have been shared by him, or found by him, or at least acknowledged by him. And he had never even known her name until tonight. He began to ask Sarah about herself, carefully now, respectfully. Not the cold interrogation of earlier, but genuine curiosity. Wanting to know who this woman was who had saved his daughter, what had made her into someone who gave without expecting anything in return. Where such selfless kindness came from in a world that usually punished it. Sarah shared pieces of her life slowly, carefully, like someone opening a book they had kept closed for a long time, telling Marcus about growing up in foster care, moving from home to home between the ages of 5 and 18, never quite belonging anywhere, never having anyone who stayed. She put herself through community college first, and then state university, working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, determined to become a teacher because she wanted to be for other children, what no one had been for her when she was small and scared, and convinced she was unlovable. She lived modestly now, she explained, spent most of her salary on her students because they needed things their parents couldn't afford, winter coats and school supplies and birthday cupcakes, so no child felt forgotten. And she found joy in small things, in the first snowfall and good coffee, and the moment when a struggling student's face lit up with understanding. There was no bitterness in her voice as she spoke. No self-pity or resentment about the hand life had dealt her. Just quiet acceptance and purpose. A woman who had decided that her painful past would make her kinder rather than harder. Marcus was struck by her dignity, by the way she spoke about hardship without making it performance or asking for sympathy. And he realized he was used to people in his world who had everything, absolutely everything, and appreciated nothing, who complained about private jet delays and vacation home renovations, while this woman in her 4-year-old dress radiated gratitude for things he took for granted. Sarah had almost nothing by his standards, and yet she seemed richer somehow, more whole, more at peace with herself than anyone he knew. Emma fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder after dinner, the girl's eyes drooping during dessert and finally closing completely as the adults talked, while her small body going heavy with the particular bonelessness of sleeping children. And Sarah adjusted automatically to accommodate her weight, stroking Emma's hair absently, naturally, the gesture so maternal it made Marcus's throat tight. He watched this woman he had dismissed an hour ago, this woman he had accused of scheming, hold his daughter with such tenderness, such unconscious care, her hand moving in slow circles on Emma's back, and something in his frozen heart began to thaw, ice cracking after a long winter. Painful and necessary and terrifying. When the check came, Marcus paid without discussion, and then suggested quietly that they take Sarah home. It was late, nearly 11, and he had a driver waiting. It was no trouble at all. Sarah protested immediately. Years of independence making her refuse help automatically, insisting she could take the subway. She did it every day. She didn't want to impose, but Marcus insisted with a gentleness that surprised them both. Not as a power play or a way to show off his wealth, but as genuine concern for this woman who had given so much to his daughter and asked for nothing in return, who would ride the subway for an hour at night because she couldn't afford anything else, and he found he couldn't bear the thought of her doing that. Not tonight. Not when he could help. In the back of Marcus's car, Emma slept between them on the leather seat, her small body warm and peaceful, one hand still clutching her father's jacket and the other resting near Sarah's arm, and the city lights streamed past the tinted windows in ribbons of gold and white. Manhattan giving way to the bridge and then to Queens beyond. Marcus asked Sarah more questions, his voice low so as not to wake Emma, wanting to understand this woman who had entered their lives so unexpectedly, asking why teaching, why Riverside Elementary specifically, when she could probably find positions at better-funded schools. What had made her want to help Emma in particular when she had 23 other students demanding her attention? Sarah explained softly that she had seen something in Emma from the very first day of school. A loneliness that went deeper than shyness, a sadness that no child should carry, a girl who needed to know that someone cared, that someone saw her, that she mattered in a world that felt too big and cold. Like you, Marcus asked gently, not as accusation but as understanding, and Sarah nodded, her eyes on Emma's sleeping face. Because yes, exactly like her. A child searching for someone to believe she was worth the effort. They were silent for a moment, the car gliding through streets that grew progressively less polished, less wealthy, buildings changing from glass towers to brick apartments, and Marcus found himself confessing things he had never said out loud. Telling Sarah that he had been failing Emma, that he knew it, that he had buried himself in work. Because it was easier than facing his daughter and seeing Rebecca's absence reflected in her eyes. Easier than confronting his own inadequacy as a single father. Easier than admitting he had no idea how to move past his wife's death. Sarah didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. Didn't tell him time heals all wounds or that he was doing his best. Just listened with the kind of attention that made him feel heard rather than judged, and somehow her silence was more comforting than any words could have been. When they arrived at Sarah's building in Queens, Marcus looked out the window and saw where she lived. The stark contrast to his world hitting him with physical force, the worn brick facade and rusted fire escape and broken streetlight. And he felt something shift inside him, a recalibration of what mattered and what didn't. Sarah gathered her purse, thanked him for dinner with sincere gratitude that made him ashamed because she was thanking him when he should be on his knees. Thanking her, and she started to open the car door to disappear into her building and out of their lives. Marcus stopped her, his hand reaching out but not quite touching her arm. and asked if she would be willing to have dinner again. Not a date, he clarified quickly, just as Emma's teacher, as someone who understood his daughter better than he did, so he could learn how to be a better father, how to see what he had been missing, how to rebuild what he had let crumble. Sarah turned back, studied his face in the dim light of the car, and saw the genuine change in him. The walls beginning to crack, the man emerging from behind the armor. And slowly, carefully, she agreed. A week passed, 7 days during which Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah Mitchell at odd moments. During board meetings and conference calls and the quiet hours before dawn when sleep refused to come, and when Saturday morning arrived, he found himself at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, waiting nervously in a way that was strange and unsettling for a man who commanded boardrooms full of executives without breaking a sweat. Sarah arrived exactly on time in jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. No makeup except maybe a touch of something that made her eyes brighter, and Marcus thought she looked more beautiful in her simplicity than any of the carefully styled women who populated his usual world. They ordered coffee and found a table in the corner, away from the weekend crowd, and began to talk. And 3 hours passed like 3 minutes, the conversation flowing with an ease that surprised them both. Marcus opened up in ways he hadn't in years, maybe ever, telling Sarah about Rebecca's death. The details he usually kept locked away behind professional courtesy and emotional distance. "It was cancer," he said, his voice rough. "Ovarian cancer, a 2-year battle that they fought with every weapon medicine could provide. And she was so brave, so impossibly brave, but in the end nothing was enough. And Emma was only 4 years old, too young to understand why Mommy was tired all the time, and then why Mommy was in the hospital, and then why Mommy wasn't coming home." He confessed that he had buried himself in work after Rebecca died, used the company as an escape, as a place where he could control outcomes and measure success, and avoid the grief that waited for him at home, and Emma had gotten lost in the shuffle, lost in his pain, raised more by housekeepers and nannies than by him. He had been operating on autopilot for 3 years, he admitted. Going through the motions of fatherhood without actually being present, signing permission slips and writing checks, but missing everything that actually mattered. Sarah listened without judgment, her dark eyes steady and compassionate. And then she shared her own losses. The parents she never knew, a mother who abandoned her at birth and a father whose name was never recorded. A foster care system that moved her from home to home like a piece of furniture that never quite fit anywhere. They discovered an unexpected connection in their shared wounds. 2 people shaped by loss in different ways, both learning to survive in worlds that hadn't been kind, both carrying grief they had never fully processed. Marcus realized as they talked that Sarah wasn't interested in his money, didn't ask about Wellington Industries or his net worth or the trappings of his wealth, barely seemed to notice or care about any of it. Instead, she asked about his heart, about his daughter, about his grief, about the man underneath the CEO title, and no one, absolutely no one, had done that in 3 years. Marcus started picking up Emma from school himself, arriving 15 minutes early each day, parking across the street and watching the children pour out of Riverside Elementary like a joyful flood, and he would talk to Sarah for those few precious minutes while Emma gathered her things. Conversations that were building something between them. A friendship carefully constructed, respectfully maintained, both of them aware of the boundaries but also aware of the connection growing beneath the surface. He began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The way Sarah's shoes were worn at the heels and carefully polished to hide their age. The way she shared her lunch with students who had forgotten theirs or whose parents couldn't afford the cafeteria prices. Her endless patience with the difficult kids who tested boundaries and acted out and needed someone to see past their behavior to their pain. He was moved by her selflessness in ways he couldn't fully articulate. This woman who gave and gave without ever seeming depleted, who found joy in the giving itself, rather than in any recognition or reward. One rainy afternoon in late October, he waited for Emma under the school's awning and watched through the downpour as Sarah gave her coat to a shivering student. A little boy whose parents were late for pickup, who stood in his thin hoodie looking miserable and cold. Sarah draped her coat over his small shoulders, zipped it up under his chin, and then stood in the rain herself. soaked within seconds, her blouse clinging to her skin and her hair plastered to her face, but smiling. Actually smiling. As she distracted the boy with a story about her own childhood, Marcus felt something clench in his chest, watching her. This woman who would literally give the coat off her back to a child who needed it, who found ways to be generous even when she had almost nothing to give. When Emma finally emerged and the boy's parents arrived apologetic and grateful, Marcus offered Sarah a ride home. Wouldn't take no for an answer. And she climbed into his car dripping and shivering, leaving wet marks on the leather seat she tried unsuccessfully to avoid. In the car, Marcus asked her why she had given away her coat, why she always gave away everything. And Sarah looked at him with genuine confusion, as if the question didn't make sense, as if the answer was so obvious it barely needed stating. He needed it more, she said simply, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. And that was it. No elaboration, no self-congratulation, just a statement of fact that left Marcus baffled and amazed by this woman, who operated on principles he had forgotten existed. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Marcus spent 2 hours researching women's coats, reading reviews, comparing materials, and finally ordered one to be delivered to Sarah's classroom, expensive and warm, and exactly her size, because he had asked Mrs. Chen to check Sarah's closet during the last parent volunteer day, and he had it sent anonymously even though Sarah would absolutely know who sent it. But this way she wouldn't feel obligated, wouldn't feel like she owed him anything. Could accept the gift as what it was. A quiet thank you from someone who was learning to see the world differently. Emma asked on a Tuesday afternoon, her small voice hopeful and tentative as Marcus buckled her into the car after school, if Miss Mitchell could come to dinner at their house. Maybe on Friday. Please, Daddy. Please, because she wanted to show her teacher her room and her books and the view from the balcony that made her feel like she was flying. Marcus agreed, his heart immediately tight with nervousness about Sarah seeing his world, from the penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows and original artwork, and the kind of luxury that screamed wealth in ways that made him suddenly uncomfortable, a stark reminder of their different lives that he wished he could somehow soften or hide. Sarah arrived on Friday evening at 6:30, carrying a plastic container of homemade chocolate chip cookies for Emma. Nothing expensive or impressive, just something she had baked in her tiny kitchen because she never showed up empty-handed. And Marcus found himself deeply moved by the gesture, by her refusal to try to match his world, and her comfort in offering what she could. Emma grabbed Sarah's hand immediately and pulled her on a tour, showing her the bedroom that was bigger than Sarah's entire apartment, the shelves full of books that Sarah herself had recommended, the window seat where Emma did her reading, and then stopped at the photo on the nightstand, a picture of a beautiful woman with Emma's eyes and a smile that lit up the frame. Sarah noticed, asked about her gently, "Who is this?" And Emma said quietly, "That's my mommy. She died when I was little." And for the first time in months the girl talked about Rebecca, about memories she thought she had lost, about missing her mother and being scared she would forget her face. And Marcus stood in the doorway listening with tears in his eyes because Sarah had given his daughter permission to remember, had created a space where grief was allowed rather than avoided. Over dinner, take-out pizza at Emma's enthusiastic request rather than the catered elegance Marcus had initially planned. Something shifted in the air between them, the atmosphere warming and softening into something that felt dangerously close to family. Marcus found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in years, real laughter that came from his belly rather than polite social noise, as Sarah told stories about her students, the boy who brought his pet lizard for show and tell in his pocket without permission, the girl who insisted that dolphins were just wet dogs, and Emma giggled until she had hiccups, her face bright with joy. After Emma went to bed, after hugs and stories and good-night kisses, Marcus and Sarah sat on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights of Manhattan spread before them like scattered diamonds, and in the darkness Marcus confessed what he had been too afraid to say in daylight. He was afraid, he told her, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid of feeling again, afraid of failing again, afraid of losing again. Because loving Rebecca had been the best thing in his life and losing her had nearly destroyed him, and he didn't know if he was strong enough to survive that kind of loss twice. 2 weeks later, crisis struck with the sudden violence that life sometimes delivers without warning. Emma collapsed at school during art class, her small body crumpling to the floor while she held a paintbrush. High fever burning through her like wildfire. An infection, the school nurse said grimly as she called 911. Something serious. Something that needed immediate attention. Marcus was in Los Angeles for a crucial board meeting, sitting in a conference room on the 43rd floor discussing a merger worth $400 million when Sarah's call came through, her voice tight with controlled panic, saying Emma was being rushed to the hospital, that she was going with her, that he needed to come now. Sarah stayed with Emma through everything, held the frightened girl's hand when the paramedics lifted her onto the gurney, rode in the ambulance while Emma cried for her daddy, sat in the emergency room while doctors ran tests and asked questions. Sarah did her best to answer even though she wasn't family, wasn't listed on any forms, was just a teacher who loved this child enough to refuse to leave her alone. When Marcus arrived at the hospital 5 hours later, having chartered a private jet and broken every speed limit between LAX and his Manhattan office where his driver waited, he was frantic, wild-eyed, his tie loosened, and his perfect composure shattered into pieces. He found Sarah in the waiting room, still there, exhausted, her clothes wrinkled and her eyes red from worry and lack of sleep, and she stood when she saw him, told him Emma was stable now. The infection caught in time. Antibiotics working. She would be okay. Sarah had stayed the entire time, had missed her own evening graduate classes that she was taking to get her master's degree, had missed dinner and rest and everything else, just to make sure Emma wasn't alone, wasn't scared, had someone who loved her nearby. Marcus listened to her explain what the doctors had said, nodded along, maintained his composure until Sarah finished speaking, and then the weight of his failure came crashing over him like a building collapse, the realization that he hadn't been there when his daughter needed him. Again, that he had been across the country talking about money while Emma lay terrified in an ambulance, that if Sarah hadn't been there, his baby would have been alone. He broke down right there in the hospital corridor under the harsh fluorescent lights, this billionaire CEO who never showed weakness, never lost control, and he cried like a child while Sarah held him, her arms around him strong and steady. Not judging, not offering empty platitudes, just presence, just the gift of not being alone in his grief and guilt and overwhelming gratitude. In that moment, pressed against her shoulder while she stroked his back and whispered that Emma was okay, that everything would be okay, Marcus realized with absolute clarity that he had fallen in love with this woman, deeply and completely and irrevocably in love, not despite her humble life but because of her immense heart, because she had shown him what love actually looked like when stripped of everything except the choice to stay, to care, to be present when presence was all that mattered. Emma recovered over the next few days, her fever breaking on the second night, her color returning, her smile emerging tentatively like sunshine after a storm, and Marcus took time off work for the first time in 3 years. Actually took time off, canceled meetings and delegated responsibilities, and told his board that his daughter came first, that everything else could wait. Sarah visited every day after school, arriving with homework packets and new books and stories that made Emma giggle, bringing laughter into the sterile hospital room in a way that felt like medicine the doctors couldn't prescribe. And Marcus watched the two of them together, his daughter and this woman who had become essential, and felt his heart expanding in ways that were terrifying and wonderful all at once. One evening, after Emma had finally fallen asleep around 8:30, exhausted from a day of visitors and tests and the effort of healing, Marcus and Sarah sat together on the uncomfortable hospital room couch, speaking in whispers so as not to wake the sleeping girl. And Marcus felt something building in his chest, pressure that had been accumulating for weeks, words that needed to be said before he lost his courage. He told Sarah he needed to say something, his voice shaking slightly, and she turned to look at him in the dim light, her face concerned and open and beautiful. He was terrified, absolutely terrified, but he couldn't hold it anymore. couldn't keep pretending these feelings weren't consuming him, and so he told her simply, directly, that he loved her. Not for what she could give him, not for any practical reason or logical calculation, but for who she was, for her kindness that never seemed to run dry, for her strength that came from surviving things that would have broken most people, for her beautiful, generous heart that gave and gave without counting the cost. He knew their worlds were different, he said. Knew that he had money and power and she had neither. Knew that she might not feel the same way and that this might be one-sided or impossible or just wishful thinking. But he needed her to know, needed her to understand what she had come to mean to him and to Emma. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her face, catching the light from the hallway. And when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. She told him she had been afraid to hope, afraid to even let herself imagine that what she felt could be returned. Because he was from a different world, a world of penthouses and private jets and possibilities she couldn't even dream of, and she had nothing to offer him. Nothing except herself, and that had never seemed like enough. But Marcus took her hands in his, held them tightly, and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You have everything," he said, his voice fierce and certain and full of truth. "You brought us back to life. You took a broken man and a grieving child, and you gave us hope again, gave us reasons to smile, showed us how to be a family. You have everything that matters." Sarah confessed through her tears that she loved him too, had been falling for him since the night he walked back into the Sterling room, since that moment when she saw him choose humility over pride, when he crouched down to listen to his daughter and then came back to apologize, to start over, to be vulnerable enough to admit he was wrong. She had tried not to fall, had built walls around her heart, because loving someone from his world seemed like a recipe for heartbreak. But he had dismantled those walls brick by brick with his gentleness, his transformation, his willingness to learn and change and be present for his daughter. They kissed for the first time there on that uncomfortable hospital couch, gentle and tentative and full of promise. And it felt like coming home to a place neither of them had known they were searching for, two broken people finding wholeness in each other. The next morning, Emma woke slowly around 7:30, her eyes blinking open to the unfamiliar hospital room. And the first thing she saw was her father and her teacher sitting by her bedside holding hands, their fingers intertwined. And the girl's face transformed with pure joy, a happiness so complete and unguarded it made both adults want to cry. "Does this mean Miss Mitchell can be my mommy?" Emma asked, her voice still hoarse from sleep, but vibrant with hope. And Marcus and Sarah laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from overwhelming emotion finding release, and they told her gently that they needed to take things slow, needed to be careful and thoughtful. But yes, they were going to try. They were going to see if they could build something real and lasting together. Emma declared it the best day ever, even from a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and hospital food waiting on a tray. Because the two people she loved most in the world loved each other, and what could possibly be better than that? They spent the afternoon together, the three of them, a new kind of family forming in that sterile room, playing card games and reading stories and talking about what came next. And the air felt different somehow, lighter, full of possibility instead of grief. When Sarah finally had to leave around 6, needing to go home and prepare for the next school day, Emma made them both promise that Sarah would come back tomorrow, made them pinky swear and cross their hearts, and only then would she let Sarah go. Marcus walked Sarah to her car in the hospital parking garage, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, their footsteps echoing in the concrete space, and before she could open her door, he stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. He asked her to think about something, his voice serious but tender. Told her to let him help her. Not because she needed saving or because he thought she was incapable, but because she had been saving everyone else for so long, had poured herself out for her students and for Emma and for everyone who needed her. And maybe it was time to let someone take care of her for once, to accept help not as weakness but as love. Months passed in a gentle progression of seasons, winter melting into spring and spring blooming into early summer, and Marcus and Sarah navigated their relationship carefully, thoughtfully, with Emma always at the center of their decisions and their hearts. Sarah continued teaching at Riverside Elementary, refused Marcus's multiple offers to solve her financial struggles, to pay off her student loans, or move her into a better apartment, or give her the kind of security his money could easily provide, because she needed to maintain her independence, her sense of purpose, her identity as someone who had built her own life through hard work rather than circumstance. But she accepted small things. Dinners at the penthouse several nights a week, weekends spent together as a makeshift family, movie nights and park visits, and the gift of simply being part of their lives, woven into the fabric of their days in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Marcus learned from her how to be present, how to put down his phone during dinner, and actually listen when Emma talked about her day, how to find joy in simple moments like baking cookies or flying kites in Central Park, or reading bedtime stories with all the character voices, things he had forgotten mattered or perhaps had never learned in the first place. Emma blossomed with two parents loving her reading soaring to the top of her class, her confidence growing, her smiles coming easier, the sad, quiet girl transforming into someone bright and talkative and secure in the knowledge that she was seen and valued and cherished. The school year ended in June, with the chaos of field day and award ceremonies and tearful goodbyes, and Sarah was offered a position as vice principal starting in the fall, a significant raise and recognition of her leadership that had been earned through her own merit. Through years of dedication and innovation and the respect of her colleagues, nothing to do with Marcus or his influence or his money. She accepted with pride, feeling for the first time in her life like she was building something substantial, a career that mattered, a future that was hers. On the last day of school, after the students had been dismissed and the classroom was empty except for goodbye cards covering her desk and construction paper decorations coming down from the walls, Marcus showed up in the doorway holding a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind Sarah had once mentioned loving, with Emma beside him practically vibrating with excitement. He walked into the classroom that had been the site of so much transformation, where his daughter had learned to read and where he had learned to see, and asked Sarah a question that made her heart stop. "Move in with us," he said, his voice steady but his eyes vulnerable. "Not as a fairy tale where I rescue you or you complete us, but as a partnership, as equals building something together. Let us be your family too." Sarah stood surrounded by her students' goodbye cards with their crayon drawings and misspelled thank yous, Emma's hopeful face looking up at her with those gray eyes, so much like her father's, and she said yes, simply and certainly yes, because this was what love looked like when it was real, when it was built on respect and friendship, and the choice to keep choosing each other every single day. 1 year later, Marcus and Sarah stood in the Sterling Room, the same restaurant where their story had almost ended before it truly began. But this time, they stood as husband and wife, celebrating their wedding reception in the intimate private room upstairs, with close friends and family gathered around them in soft candlelight and joy. Emma was the flower girl, beaming in her white dress with pink ribbons, her face radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from having two parents who love her and love each other, and she had performed her duties with such serious concentration during the ceremony that the guests had laughed with delight. The maître d', who had witnessed their disastrous first meeting, that night of accusations and walkouts and tears, served them champagne with a knowing smile because he had seen enough in his decades at the Sterling Room to recognize a love story when it circled back to its beginning, and he told them quietly that he had hoped they would find their way back to each other. Sarah still taught at Riverside Elementary as vice principal now, still poured her heart into her students, but she came home to the penthouse that no longer felt cold or empty, but instead held her books on every surface, her warmth in every room, her love woven into the space that had once been a mausoleum of grief. Marcus still ran Wellington Industries, but he left the office at 5 o'clock every single day. Never missed Emma's bedtime, never let a board meeting take precedence over a school play or a parent conference, or simply sitting at dinner listening to his daughter talk about her day. They had built something real from broken pieces, not a fairy tale where everything was perfect and easy, but something better, something stronger, A family forged from loss and kindness and second chances, three people who had found each other when they needed it most. Emma read now at the top of her class, devoured books like other children devoured candy, and she wrote stories about a princess who saved herself and a king who learned to be human, tales that made her teacher father beam with pride and her teacher mother cry happy tears. Marcus kept a framed photo on his desk now, not hidden in a drawer collecting dust and shame, but displayed openly next to his computer. A picture of Rebecca smiling in the garden, honoring her memory and the love they had shared. And next to it sat a new photo. Sarah and Emma, laughing in the penthouse kitchen. Covered in flour from a baking disaster, their faces full of life and joy and the beautiful mess of living. He had learned that love doesn't replace love, that his heart was big enough to hold both Rebecca's memory and Sarah's presence, that grief and joy could coexist, that moving forward wasn't betrayal but survival, and that sometimes the best things in life came from the courage to walk back in when everything told you to walk away. That night, as they danced their first dance as husband and wife, while Emma watched with shining eyes, and their guests smiled through happy tears, Sarah leaned close and whispered against his ear, "Thank you for walking back in." Marcus kissed her forehead, held her closer, and whispered back the truth that had become the foundation of everything they had built together. "Thank you for being worth walking back for." Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a mistake, with a misjudgment, with a moment when we almost lose something precious before we even realize its value. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the humility to admit we were wrong, the courage to try again, and the wisdom to recognize that the person standing in front of us, humble and kind, and asking for nothing, might be offering us everything that truly matters.